This webquest is going to address the emergence of the first political parties, beginning with the end of George Washington's presidency. George Washington is the first president of the United States. He's going to serve for 2 terms, so from the Constitutional Convention and the adoption of the Constitution until the end of George Washington's presidency. His 2 terms is 8 years. We end up in 1796, which you can always remember because it's 4 years before 1800, so the turn of the century. George Washington will leave office, and he gives us two pieces of advice upon leaving office. Here's a picture of him giving his farewell address. His farewell address, he said 2 things. He said, don't form political parties, and don't get entangled in foreign alliances, or foreign entanglements is what he referred to them as. Well, like we often do with our parents, we ignored his advice entirely. So as soon as he was no longer president, we went out and number 1, we formed political parties, and number 2, we became involved in foreign entanglements. We basically got involved in what we refer to as the War of 1812. Now, there was a lot of controversy after Washington resigned. His vice president, John Adams, would then become president. Some of the controversies included this document, which is the Jay Treaty. The Jay Treaty essentially gave trading rights away to the British, which really infuriated a lot of the folks who were living in the interior of the country, because they felt like, well, we fought this war, shouldn't we get the benefits of having fought this war? Shouldn't we have access to all of the trade in the interior of the country, basically the Mississippi River Valley? Now, the folks who were doing that trading tended to be farmers and tradespeople. They tended not to be the bankers or industrialists of the Northeast. Well, those farmers also sort of tended more towards a vision of the country which is going to be based on farming. That vision of the country was more supported by the opponents of the new president, the second president, John Adams. Those opponents were known as Democratic Republicans. So we're going to form these new political parties. One party is going to be called the Federalists. The other party is going to be called the Democratic Republicans. Now here you want to keep in mind the phrase, the Federalists are not the Federalists, and the Democratic Republicans are not the Democrats or the Republicans, which doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. The Federalists are not the Federalists. Let's take that. What we mean there is that the Federalists, when we learned about them in the past, they were fighting over the Constitution. It was the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists fighting over ratification of the Constitution. Well, now that the Constitution has been ratified, that fight is gone. The Federalists and the Anti-Federalists as groups basically just disappear. George Washington is president for 8 years, so we're almost 10 years later now. And John Adams becomes president. John Adams was someone who agreed with the ideas of the Federalists. In fact, he was one of the authors of the Federalist Papers. But now that political parties are going to come into existence, this group of people who are affiliated with John Adams and also Alexander Hamilton, they need a name, and so they're looking around for a brand name or a name for themselves, and they go back to the debate over the Constitution and they say, hey, let's name ourselves the Federalists. Well, their opposing political group is a group known as the Democratic Republicans. The leader of the Democratic Republicans is Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison are sort of often seen as the 2 major leaders of the Democratic Republicans. And they come from very different places. So let's take a quick look at kind of where they come from, beginning with the Federalists. John Adams and Alexander Hamilton are our leaders. To have a sense of what this group is, I think it's good to take a quick look at who the leaders were. John Adams, and I have a picture of John Adams here. John Adams was from Boston, and he was a lawyer. In fact, he actually defended the soldiers from the Boston Massacre, the ones who shot on the sort of so-called innocent civilians. He was the one who stood up and defended them. Alexander Hamilton is from New York, and he is a banker. So you've got a banker from New York and a lawyer from Boston. You take a banker from New York, you take a lawyer from Boston, you put them together, and what do you think they're going to believe in? Well, bankers and lawyers often believe in industry. Someone from Boston and someone from New York is definitely going to think of the United States as being best off with industry and so forth. They make up the Federalists. By comparison, the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, well, here's Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson is from Virginia. He was a planter. In addition, originally, he was the governor of Virginia for a while. He represented Virginia at the House of Burgesses. During the Revolution, he went to France and was there along with John Adams and Ben Franklin to help negotiate for some help. The irony is John Adams and Thomas Jefferson had a long personal relationship, and they hated each other. They came from completely opposite sides of the political spectrum, but, and this is crazy, they actually died on the exact same day. Thomas Jefferson from Virginia, a planter who owned slaves, actually had children with one of his slaves. Some say as many as 8 children with one of his slaves. But he was a farmer. He lived on his plantation. He believed in cash crops. James Madison, also a farmer, and also from Virginia. So you've got 2 guys from Virginia kind of going up against 2 guys from the Northeast, from New York and from Boston, respectively. So the Democratic Republicans believe that what's good for Virginia, what's good for farmers, is good for the nation. So they want a country that is based on farming, an economy of farming. They don't want a strong national government. They want a weak national government. And those 2 political parties, the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists, really sort of come to define the early America. Now, in 1800, those 2 political parties will face off against each other in the election of 1800. John Adams, who had been George Washington's vice president, will serve for 4 years. He serves 1 term, and then he runs in an election against Thomas Jefferson. Now, this is the first time that 2 political parties have faced off against each other in an election. And the amazing thing is that when Thomas Jefferson is elected, John Adams gives up power, hands over power to an opposing political group, and no one has to die, which I always say is one of the miracles of being in America, that you could have one political party hand over power to another political party and people didn't have to go and kill each other. Well, that's a pretty amazing thing. In 1800, Thomas Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans will take over, and he will become the 3rd president of the United States. He will then be president from 1800 until 1808, at which point James Madison, Thomas Jefferson's buddy in the Democratic Republicans, will then take over and become the 4th president of the United States.